Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to DNA Day, hosted by Family Search Library and in partnership with Roots Tech. My name is Savannah, and I will be moderating this last presentation today. Today, we will present 7 classes, and we have presented 7 classes. This is the last one. We are glad that you could join us. Before we get started with this class, we will have a couple of housekeeping items. These classes are being live streamed on several platforms, including Family Search Library's Facebook page and rootstech.org. The recordings for these classes will be available on rootstech.org in the next few days. We created a wiki page for today's class content, including the handouts for individuals. The link to the wiki page will be shared in the chat throughout the day and throughout the rest of this class. Our presenters will answer questions at the end of the presentation as time allows. Please post your questions in the chat or comment section, and we will pass the questions along to the presenter at the end of the class. If you need help with a specific DNA research problem, we encourage you to sign up to meet one-on-one with our research specialists for a free 40-minute consultation. Go to the Family Search Library's website at familysearchlibrary.org/library and click Research Help. If you want to view upcoming webinars taught by the Family Search Library, go to the Family Search Library Classes and Webinars wiki page, which will also be linked in the chat. Recordings of previous classes can be found on the Family Search Library's Facebook page if you would like to see previous recordings. Now let's introduce our presenter. The presenter for this class is Tanner Tolman. Tanner Tolman is accredited through the International Commission for Accreditation of Professional Genealogists, or ICAPGen, for research in the Denmark region. He has a deep passion for both Scandinavian and DNA research and works full-time as a research specialist at the Family Search Library in Salt Lake City, Utah. Tanner also serves as the second vice president of the Utah Genealogical Association and as a co-administrator on the Yeoman's Y-DNA Surname Project. He enjoys family history, Palpatine, bacon burgers, and Venusaur. But most of all, he enjoys playing with his wife and 3 small children. Let's welcome Tanner.
Thanks. Okay, so this class is why do your Y-DNA. The objectives for this class is that you will understand what Y-DNA is, understand how it can help you with your genealogy, and also be excited about Y-DNA and its potential. So the Y chromosome, this was discovered in 1905. And it's important because its presence or absence is what determines biological sex. It is 62 million base pairs long, and it contains 693 genes. Its number one job is to produce testosterone. Now, because it's what determines biological sex, there are some unique things about it. It is only inherited from father to son. And so on your tree, it would come up through these ancestors from your father and your grandfather, your great-grandfather, all the way back to Adam. It only changes through mutation. The other chromosomes are going to mix and match and recombine, but this one does not. Now, it has a much higher mutation rate than all the other chromosomes. It is the fastest evolving part of the human genome. So mutations are actually really good for genealogy because, as I'm going to show, they allow us to track how ancestors were related to each other. Okay, so this is a brief history of man, which means we're going to be talking about ancient haplogroups. So all men go back to this man called Y chromosomal Adam. And he is the most recent common ancestor that all patrilineal lines connect at. Now, he was not the first man, and he definitely was not biblical Adam. This is just a nickname. Now, hopefully I can say that without ruffling any feathers. I think it's easy to prove he's not biblical Adam, because if you don't believe in the Bible, you don't believe that Adam existed. And if you do believe in the Bible, then the most recent male that we all connect to is actually Noah. So really, this is just a nickname, and you can become Y chromosomal Adam yourself. All you have to do is just kill every other man who's on Earth, and then repopulate the entire world by yourself. And congratulations, now you're Y chromosome Adam. Please do not do that. Now, anyhow, Y chromosome Adam belonged to a haplogroup that we call haplogroup A. And it's called haplogroup A because it's the original one. The next major mutation in the human family is something called haplogroup BT. And this was formed by a mutation that happened. Now, specifically at base pair with this big long number 6932831, basically what that means is if you were to take the Y chromosome and you were to lay it flat, the leftmost gene is going to be gene 1 or SNP1. And then they're going to go up in order 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 61 million, however long it is. So this number, this means it's probably about 10% of the way. And at that point, there was a G that just happened in this one male to mutate to an A. Now, this mutation would have been invisible. He would have had no way of knowing that his Y chromosome was different than anyone else's. And like it didn't give him purple eyes or wings or pink skin. It just happened. And we know that it happened a long time ago and was totally invisible. So this man, though, is really important because after having that mutation, he then had sons that he passed the mutation on to. And so all men on Earth, except for those who are in haplogroup A, are a descendant of this man, BT. Now, he had two sons at least, and they are called B and CT. They were not his literal sons. They were his patrilineal descendants. So they could have been his direct sons or his grandsons or his great grandsons or whatever, but probably they were several generations down. So CT, this was formed when just a random man who was a descendant of BT had another mutation, this time about 14 million base pairs in. And in this case, a C just happened to mutate to a T. Now, these mutations, again, they were invisible and nothing's really special about them except for how long ago they happened. And so we can test for these mutations to see which branch of the human family you belong to. Now, he also would have had two distant patrilineal descendants that we're going to call CF and DE. So CF branched off with another mutation about 14 million base pairs in. This time it's a G to a C. And he had two sons, C and F. Now, C and F was formed with a mutation that happened 21 million base pairs in. But again, the locations don't matter, they're just random. I'm just trying to emphasize that random SNPs on the Y chromosome changed randomly from one letter to another. Um, and he had these two sons, F, and one called GHIFJK, which is an extinct macro haplogroup. Because haplogroups G, H, I, J, and K really all break off from it at about the same time, all within quick succession. Some interesting things about this person. It's thought that members of the G family were the first farmers in Europe. I is commonly found in Scandinavians, and it's really thought that I was the first people in Europe. And then later people in Europe really come through one of the many branches of the K clade. Now, K itself is really actually found in low levels in every continent except Antarctica, which makes sense. And it's really rare and under researched. So if you are in haplogroup K, please take a big Y. It's really going to help science. But all these other smaller haplogroups branch off from it. P breaks off, and then Q and R. R is very commonly found in Europeans. Q is very commonly found in Native Americans. One thing that's kind of fun for people of Spanish descent, a lot of times they'll have a family story that they either come from Native Americans on their patrilineal line or Spaniards, and a DNA test will usually tell you which one. If you're in haplogroup R, chances are you go back to Spaniards. And if you're in haplogroup Q, it's most likely Native Americans. RM269, this is a distant descendant of R. This is a very common haplogroup. This is my haplogroup, Joseph Smith's haplogroup. You have a very high, if you're European, you have a very high chance of being in this one. It's associated with the Yan Maya culture, and those were the people that brought the Indo-European language into Europe. Now, each of these major haplogroups has many more sons, which means they have sub-haplogroups. And more of these are being discovered all the time. Genetic genealogists often connect recent haplogroups to particular surnames or to even distinct branches of the family. So what genealogists are doing is they're looking for these most recent branches, and they're using them to solve brick walls. Specifically, the goal is to find specific Y-DNA mutations, link them to specific individuals, and give them names, dates, and faces. If we know that a certain SNP originated in a certain person, then we can test for that SNP in all other people to see if they descend from them or not. So with Y-DNA, you've got some testing options that really you've got family tree DNA. Now, even though all the companies test a limited amount of SNPs on the Y chromosome, only family tree DNA tests enough data to give you a match list. So a lot of times people will say to me, but I took a 23andMe and they told me what my Y-DNA haplogroup is. Can I upload that and get a match to family tree DNA and get a match list? The answer is no. You have to test with family tree DNA directly if you want a Y-DNA match list. Now, within family tree DNA, there are three options. There's Y37, Y111, and there's the big Y. Now, the Y37, and I put the base prices here, they go on sale periodically. In fact, they're all on sale right now as part of DNA Day. This one predicts your broad haplogroup and your closest relatives. So a broad haplogroup would be like RM269. It may suggest what your genetic surname is. Basically, when you look at your match list, if all of your closest matches are Tolmans, then probably your genetic surname is Tolman. This test, since it's the cheapest one, is really good at testing the waters. In other words, it lets you see how good your match list is. And then if you like what you see, you can upload or you can upgrade to one of the more expensive tests by paying the difference. Now, the reason that I've got a picture of Saturn here on this screen is one of my favorite memories of being a child was I was really interested in astronomy. And one of our neighbors told me that he would let me see Saturn with his telescope. So we got up at like 4 a.m. and we went out, and he knew how to point that telescope exactly where it needed to be in the sky, and he let me look through it. And I saw Saturn with my own eyes, and it pretty much looked like this. This is really what the Y37 is kind of doing. It's giving you an idea of what your ancestry is. It's like looking at Saturn through that telescope as a kid. That telescope was like 10 feet long, and it took all that to make an image even as big as a pea. Now, if you upgrade That is like looking at your matches with the Hubble telescope. So you're seeing Saturn more clearly. The Y111 predicts your broad haplogroup and also your closest relatives, but it's going to provide more accurate estimations on how closely you're related to them than the Y37 can, because it's testing 3 times as many markers. The big Y proves your extremely specific haplogroup and your closest relatives. And this is the one that people are using to solve complicated genealogy problems. So if the 37 is like my little at-home telescope, 111 is like the Hubble, Big Y is like taking a probe and flying down to Saturn specifically and getting a very close view of all the rings and the moons and the details. It's definitely the most accurate of the 3 tests. Now, I hope that you do all go buy Big Ys after this presentation, but I need to give you some honest reality. If I let you go buy a Big Y thinking that, oh, it's $500, but if I just fork out my money, all my problems are going to be solved, I am misleading you. Most people do not have useful serendipitous matches. The people who are solving brick walls with Y-DNA are usually target testing. Ancestry has over 20 million people in their autosomal database, and I believe that they just announced 100,000 Big Y testers. Um, so the databases are quite a bit smaller. I think there's about 1 million Y37s. I don't know for sure. Um, Now, also, if you have a big Y or a 111, but your match only has Y37, you can still only compare with them at the Y37 level. So it is important to look at all 3 match lists that the companies give you for that reason. You can only make comparisons at the lower of the 2. A lot of people think that when they buy a Y37, that really the company is testing all the way up to big Y and just not showing it to you, and they're really not. So both test takers have to go up to big Y or 111 to see each other at that list. My dad, his closest Y-DNA match is actually a first cousin. But even though my dad has big Y, because this cousin only has 37, that's the only match list that he shows up on. So I like to think of Big Y this way, or Y-DNA in general. Y-DNA doesn't know what your brick wall is, and it really can't answer questions in the way that you would hope. There is one question that Y-DNA is very good at answering, and it's this: how closely are these 2 men related on their patrilineal line? It's very good at answering that question. So, in order to solve brick walls, you play 20 questions. So, you target test 2 people and you see what the results are. And then, based on that, you look for a third person and you target test them. And then, by testing enough people, eventually you get to the answer. I recommend when you target test that you buy Y37s to make sure you have the match, and then you or you upgrade to Big Y, just so you don't accidentally pay a ton of money and it turns out that they're adopted and their Y-DNA is not going to help you at all. Okay, so this is a case study using the Big Y, and this is the Yemen's Yeoman project. So my grandfather's surname is Yemen, and that's why I have an interest in this particular family. So I got him to take a DNA test, and this is his match list at the 37. So I've covered up the names, but I'm showing you the surnames. And so the top match is Yeomans, spelled like you, and then we have a Yemen down here. Um, the genetic distance right here, this is a genetic distance of 1. The lower the genetic distance, usually the closer that relative is going to be. Now, one of these is actually a second cousin. All the others are actually so distantly related that we actually don't know what the exact connection is. The one that is the second cousin is actually this one down here. Even though he's a genetic distance of 3, he is in reality far closer related than any of these other people. And so what we're seeing with this Y37 is if grandpa was adopted, this would give him a pretty good clue of what his genetic surname probably is, probably Yeomans or Yemen. And it gives him a place to start looking. Now, when you click on the little calendar option, it estimates how far back the common ancestor is. Now, with this particular second cousin, the common ancestor was born in 1864. With a genetic distance of 3, it estimates the common ancestor was born about 1500, but it says anywhere between 1000 and 800 common era. Now, that makes a pretty big difference for your genealogy. If the common ancestor is 17 or 1800s, you can figure out who it is. But if it's 1100 or 1000, it's going to be too far back. So this is a huge range. Now, when we look at grandpa's matches on the 111, now that second cousin has moved up to the second closest match. A genetic distance of 6 steps is actually surprisingly high, but it's become more accurate. Instead of thinking he's one of the more distant relatives, he's going up the list. Now, over here, it says markers tested, and it tells us that when it says 1 to 700, what that means is that all of these people have taken the big Y. And so we can potentially see how close of a match they are all the way up to that level. Now, this is the estimations comparing grandpa against that same second cousin. And what's happened is the genetic distance has gone up from 3 to 6. So the genetic distance has doubled, but the amount of markers tested tripled. And so it's estimating now a common ancestor around 1600 as opposed to 1500. And it's shaved down the range that the common ancestor could be in a little bit. It's no longer possible for it to fall in between 1000 and 1350. Now, it's only when you go up to the big Y that it sorts the second cousin as the closest possible relative. That's where he takes his rightful spot as the closest one. So when you go up to big Y, that is when it gives you your specific haplogroup. So originally, grandpa was just RM269. Once he goes up to big Y, it gives him this haplogroup, RFTA 12568. And this is a newly discovered haplogroup that only grandpa and the second cousin fall into. It's that specific. And this is what Y-DNA has to say about it. This haplogroup was formed when it branched off from a previous haplogroup called this RFT 161984. That's an important one for the project. It estimates that this mutation happened around 1500 CE. It'll tell you precisely it thinks 1492. Now, it thinks that after that mutation happened, that there's a time lag from that person and the most recent common ancestor of all people who are known to test with it, because again, we need many more test takers. So it's estimating the most recent common ancestor around 1750. So the Y37 said 1500, 111 said 1600, Big Y said 1750. Now, the truth is that the common ancestor is this man, Michael David Yeaman, born September 26, 1846 in Iowa. And he married in 1866 and he died in 1935. So he's actually even more recent, but of all of them, Big Y was the closest. Now, what we learned from testing Grandpa and the cousin is that both of them have a mutation that is unique to them and is not present in any other man on Earth. Specifically, at this one specific spot, he and his descendants have a T when all the rest of humanity has an A. That's one of the big reasons the Big Y is such an expensive test, is it's looking for new genes like this that have never been observed in anyone. Now, we know that Michael David Yeaman had that mutation because his descendants all have it. He could have been the first person on Earth to have it, to have the novelty, pun intended, or really, he could have inherited it from his father, his grandfather, his great grandfather. The only way to know for sure is to test more people. For example, I'd probably want to test, if I really wanted to hunt this down, I would test a descendant of one of his brothers, and I would see if they also have that unique mutation or not. If they don't, then he was the first person to have it. And if they do, then Michael and his brother would have both inherited it from their father. And we know that it comes at least from one generation higher. So, family tree DNA is estimating that the first person to have it was born about 1492. And again, that's an estimation. But if that's the case, then it's probably 12 generations even earlier than Michael. Now, Christopher Yeomans is a man who is of interest to all the Yeomans. He was born in 1638 in England. And then he immigrated to New York, where he marries Hannah Smythe. And they had 5 kids: Moses, Christopher, Solomon, Thomas, and William. And then he eventually passed away. The reason he's so important is because he's really the only yeoman that we have documentation of immigrating. And so all the living Yemens today hope or wonder if they are his direct line descendants. So the question that we have is Michael David Yeaman a descendant of Christopher? So unfortunately, because of how early Christopher emigrated, the records are really hazy. There's not enough paper trail to prove a connection. So you like to use, I recommend using Big Y when you have some records and you're trying to fill the gaps with DNA. So this important haplogroup to the research is this RFT 161984. There are 27 mutations that make this haplogroup different from the rest of mankind. The order that they happened is unknown, but it is believed that they stockpiled from 700 BC to 1492. That is what family tree DNA estimates. So the first one would have happened about 700, and then another one, and another one, and another one, until finally they were all formed when Columbus was sailing. What we have found from all of these Yemens who are taking the Big Y test is that they are all belonging to this haplogroup or descendants of it. So what we're finding is whether their surname is spelled Yemens or Yemen or Yeoman or Yeoman, they are all belonging to this same Y chromosome, which means that all of them descend from one man. And again, this man is estimated to be born 1492. But family tree DNA says he really could have been born any time between 1199 and 1702. Now, we can make some inferences about this man. I think it's safe to say that whoever this man was, whoever the common ancestor is, was probably born in England. Because we're seeing common surnames. The surname was probably Yeomanish, which means it was probably one of those variants. Um, if this man was like a Viking and he lived before surnames were a thing, this would be too big of a coincidence. You'd have tons of different surnames matching. And we know that this guy had at least two sons. Now, two sons, and again, sons is in quotations because these could be literal sons, grandsons, great grandsons, but initially, two sub branches of this haplogroup had been identified. One that was called F13736, and this was mainly the northern group, Yemens who were living in like New York. And then there was the southern group for those that were living just a little bit farther south. So those were the two branches that had been discovered at the time. Now, none of them really do have a solid documentation back to Christopher, as far as I'm aware. But members of the northern group claim descent from Solomon, who is traditionally a son of Christopher. And they all have this one unique mutation where a C changed to an A that makes their haplogroup different. Then there was the southern group. Now, members of this group claim descent from a man named Levi, and he lived a little bit later, but he's also traditionally a second great grandson of Christopher. And he's through a different son, Christopher II. And the reason I mention that is Levi is not believed to descend from Solomon. These people have a unique mutation where a C at this random location mutated to a T. So at the point that Grandpa joined the Yemen project, we had, because of all those people who had taken Big Y, there were really three SNPs that we could look for. These are just the locations of them, and these are the ancestral values. In this case, the ancestral value happens to be C at each spot. So if you have C, C, and C at all of those locations, you are not a Yemen. Now, the original Yemen code changed the first one to an A. And then in addition to that, Solomon's descendants, or Solomon's claimed descendants, have the original Yemen code, and also this third one down here mutated from C to A. And then Levi's descendants, they have the A that makes you a Yemen. They don't have this gene down here that makes you a descendant of Solomon. They just have the original value. But they do have this middle value here that marks Levi's descendants. And so by anyone else who is a Yemen can take a Big Y and see which of those SNPs they have. And this is the results for Grandpa Yemen. He has the original Yemen code. See, the original Yemen code is A, C, C, and that is exactly what he has. So he is a genetic Yemen. He does not have this A that marks Solomon's descendants. So he's coming from a different branch than them. And he does not have this T that makes him one of Levi's descendants, but he is still part of the family. Then, when the second cousin tested, because initially they were all thinking they were making such a big deal about how Grandpa had the original Yemen code and that had never been observed. But there were some private variants that were only observed in Grandpa's DNA. And it takes the same SNP appearing in two people to really create a new branch of the human family. So when the second cousin tested, that is when the gene that marks the Michael David Yemen posterity as separate from all the others, this T right here. So this here is a hypothetical tree. Since doing this presentation, we've also found one more branch. So we have this original man who was part of RFT 16984. And from that man, you have this branch of the family that's marked by one mutation, and this branch, and this branch, and now this branch. So it is very plausible that really all of these men are descending from Christopher. They certainly are all descending from one man. Um, but at this point, we really can't say for sure if it's Christopher or not, or maybe that, there could have been other undocumented yeomans that were Christopher's cousins. And it could be that I think Christopher definitely does fall into the story somehow. Um, so, how do we prove this? How do we get to really the root of our question, which is, does Michael descend from Christopher? Well, in order to do that, what we need is more test takers. What we'd ideally want, if possible, a descendant of Christopher's brother. Now, I know this tree is a little zoomed out. Um, this right here is the immigrant Christopher. And he had two brothers, John and William. So we would want to try and find a descendant of one of them, a patrilineal descendant, and test them. And the hope is of those 27 mutations that made our Yemen branch of the family unique, the hope is that they have only 26 of them. If that's the case, whichever mutation they don't have was the last one to form, because we don't know the order that those 27 mutations happened. And that last mutation would have been formed at Christopher's birth. If we can identify a SNP and prove that it was formed at Christopher's conception, then anyone else on Earth can simply test and see if they have that SNP. If they do, then they are his descendant. And if they don't, they're not. So the problem with this, there's a lot of problems. Such a SNP might not exist. Christopher could have inherited his father's Y chromosome with no mutations. Um, if we think those 27 mutations stockpiled from 700 BC to 1492 AD, my math is telling me that that means that there was a mutation about every 2 to 3 generations. So maybe Christopher had one, or his dad had one, or his grandfather. We don't know at this point. So the other problem is that really this is early research. And John and Williams, they're both stubs in the tree. So it's going to take a really skilled early colonial or British genealogist to track down their living descendants if they have any and test them. And it's possible that they don't have patrilineal descendants. Their lines could have dotted out, and their Y chromosomes gone extinct. So if that doesn't work, we need to find a mutation from like the next generation up. We'd probably look at this William and this John and try and find their patrilineal descendants. And if that doesn't work, we need to keep going up and up. Once we get to Sir William's, the family tree actually dead ends. So there's definitely more research to be done. We're in like 1500s England, so we're in a really hard time. But ideally, the closer we can get to finding a mutation around Christopher, the stronger case we can make that Christopher was closely related to all these men. I think even if we could find a patrilineal descendant of one of Christopher's uncles, and he had only 26%, or he had only 26 of the 27 mutations, then we have a really strong case that the final mutation was formed in Christopher Sr. or one of his sons. And at that point, since Christopher Jr. is the only one known to have immigrated, I think you can make a very strong case that, yes, we do descend from him. So basically, what we need is we need more test takers. There was a Sir John Yeamans who went to Barbados, and it'd be really good to get his descendants tested and compared to ours. We think that the Yeamans came from Bristol, and so we want to look for people with that name still living in Bristol and make sure they're not adopted or something, and if so, test them. and any and all Yemens. The more that we can test, the more information we can get. And so this case study is not solved yet, and it's half baked. But I mean, it's just the nature of Y-DNA. It's time consuming and it's expensive, and most people, when you call them up and ask them to test, they usually don't want to buy a $500 test, and also giving out $500 tests to those people also really adds up on the administrator's side. So we, even though we still haven't fully answered the question, do we descend from Christopher? We have learned some things. We do know that all the Yemens are related, and they are all descending from one person. And Christopher is a really strong possibility, but it's going to take more testing to really get to the bottom of it. So, in summary, testing your Y-DNA can determine your haplogroup and your deep origins. It can help you, if you're adopted, figure out your genetic surname. Um, and with enough tests and target testing, you can answer deep genealogical questions 10 generations back. So I hope that you do take a Y-DNA test. I want this database to grow because even though it is expensive and hard, there are questions that can only be answered using it. So that's the presentation. We now have time for questions if there are any.
Yeah, we've got a few started. Um, One is an anonymous person on Zoom said, "My husband's father took a Y-DNA 67. He shows matches at 25, but not at 37 or 67. What does this mean? Is it worth testing more?"
Um, I usually don't like to look at anything below 37. When you look at a test, it'll say 1 to 37, 1 to 11, 1 to 700. That's telling you how many markers the other person is paid for. Um, so usually you can't really buy a 25 in most cases. So if they're matching you at 25 but not 37, it means they're a very distant match, like 1000 AD or earlier. Again, I still maintain I want everyone to upgrade to Big Y, but also as I consider everyone's budgets, against my will, it's probably not going to answer your question at this time to upgrade.
Awesome. Debbie asked, "Is the lettering slash numbering for maternal haplogroups related to the Y haplogroup lettering and numbering, or cross-referenced in some way?" She just wanted to know, like, do can you compare them at all?
Um, I think so. Um, I don't use mitochondrial DNA nearly as much. I feel like it does go back also. There is the same idea that all women go back to mitochondrial Eve, and she was not biblical Eve, and she lived at a different time than Y chromosomal Adam. Um, I think the big haplogroups for M, they don't line up the same way. Like with Y, R is generally Europeans, Q is generally Native Americans, D is usually Aboriginal Japanese. Um, but with Europe, I think it's H and U are the main ones that you're going to see on the mitochondrial DNA.
Mm.
So they don't really line up.
Okay, that's good to know. Um, Robert is asking, oh, never mind, that's the same question. Just a second. Um, Robert is asking, correlating this talk with your last talk, when reconstructed DNA is used to reconstruct an earlier DNA reconstruction. Sorry, let me just think this through in my head. So when a reconstructed DNA kit is used to reconstruct an earlier DNA reconstruction of an ancestor, what is the possibility of the DNA fading? So sorry, jumping back to your last talk, but he's asked it
Yeah.
twice now.
Um, I don't know what is meant by the DNA fading. Um, it doesn't really do that. Um, so I guess an example, I've reconstructed my grandpa Farrell's DNA. Um, and then in order to reconstruct the next generation, his parents, I had to then reconstruct his brother and his sister. It's with each generation that passes, the living people have less of the right DNA to work with. And so it took me 8 tests to reconstruct my grandfather. Um, to reconstruct my great grandfather, I'm on 35 test takers now, and I'm still at only 90%. So it becomes exponentially harder.
Mhm. Okay, back to Y-DNA. Sharon is asking, my husband took a Y-DNA with FTDNA. Results are I am 253, but his patronymic family comes from Italy. Most of the matches are Scandinavian. Why would this happen?
Well, it depends on how closely these matches are. I mean, if these are,
Mhm.
I mean, if you took a 111 and you're getting genetic distance of 1 or 2, um, and they're all in Scandinavia, you might have a non-paternal event. You're like his father might not be who he thinks he is, or his grandfather. If it's like a genetic distance of like 6 or 7, this could be a very, distant connection. Um, so it could be going back to Viking times, and in particular, the Vikings were spreading their DNA all over Europe. But yeah, IM 253. That is usually a Scandinavian flavor to your haplogroup.
Mhm. Okay, and we've got somebody asking, can you explain again why we would take a big Y if the 37 is limited and the 111 is even more limited?
Um, so the Y37 looks at 37 markers on your Y chromosome, and it figures out who your relatives are. Um, the Y111 gives you like within if you have relatives at 37 markers, the Y111 is going to give you a more accurate prediction of how closely you're related to them, and the big Y an even better estimation. But it's also like kind of sticking your telescope up in the sky and seeing if there's a planet. Um, if you don't have matches at 37, you're not going to have matches at the higher levels. Those higher tests just take the matches you do have and they refine them. So yeah, it is, you won't get new matches. And the only way to solve that is for more and more people to take the test.
Yeah, definitely. Along those same lines, we have JC asking, we tested my uncle just prior to his death to 111 markers. We've been previously advised not to upgrade him to Big Y in case the sample has degraded, or in case there are future advances in autosomal DNA, and instead test his sons up to Big Y. Do you agree? Is this a real concern? What would be your advice there?
Hmm, I would probably, I mean, if you test his sons at big Y instead of him, those mutations, right, that big Y is looking for, they happen about every 2 to 3 generations. So the sons might have the exact same Y chromosome as him, or they might have one mutation that just makes theirs slightly different. I tested my dad's big Y, and I one day I will test my own just to see for fun if there's a mutation. But right now, my wife is like, "No, Tanner, we have bills to pay. You can't do that." Um, so It'll probably give you pretty much the exact same information, but there is a slight chance that there's going to be a mutation in the kid's DNA.
And in that case, would time be a factor in whether or not you should upgrade a test for somebody who's deceased? This is more just
So,
me being curious.
family tree DNA freezes your samples, and they can last up to 25 years that way. Um, so I don't think it'll either pass or fail, right? If you take a sample. The main thing I would get worried about, like, is if I've tested somebody and they've since passed away. If say I tested somebody at Y37 and then they die, I wouldn't recommend going up to 111 and then getting mitochondrial and then getting autosomal and then getting big Y and making them run that sample a million times because you might run it out. I would just give them the full package, be like, they're dead. This is the last chance we have to get their DNA, and just buy all of them at once. So they run all of them from the same spit.
Well, that's good advice. Stephanie from Facebook is asking, what do we know about the Q haplogroup? All of my dads and uncles are matching on that one. Um, matches
Yeah.
are, yeah, sorry.
So generally Q is Native Americans, but not always. Like there's mixtures of each one everywhere. Um, so it would depend on what specific haplogroup they're in. Um, you can look that up on Google or Wikipedia. If you have on Family Tree DNA, um, you can look up the exact haplogroup and it'll tell you everything that's known about it. Um, Especially if you have big Y, when you hover over it on the top, um, I'm nervous to show it live in case I show a living person. But like at the same place where you'd click to see your matches, there's a Discover Haplogroup Reports, and it'll tell you everything known.
Okay. And then I feel like you may have already answered this, but Heather from Facebook is asking, in the search for a non-paternal event, is there any benefit to upgrading from a 111 test to a big Y, if only for the matches? Um, only tested, like if the only match is only tested up to 111.
Right. So when you upgrade, you never get more matches, almost never. Like there's been one or two times where the Y37 has a cutoff of 7 genetic distance and the 111 has a cutoff of 10. So there's been like twice where I've seen somebody gain a match by going up a test. But it's always a distant match. Yeah, if you're just trying to like find a non-paternal event that's really recent, like your father, your grandfather, your great grandfather, probably the Y37 is going to do what it needs to do.
Okay. I think those are all of the major questions. If you have another question, say it now. Um,
Yeah. So if it generally, I think with all the questions where the question is it worth upgrading to big Y? Generally it's, are you trying to solve a brick wall in this like hazy time period, like colonial US research, 1600s, 1700s? In that case, you're going to need a lot of target tested big Ys. Otherwise, I just selfishly hope you buy a big Y in the name of science. My dream is to become president of the United States. Um, and then use that $400,000 salary a year to just be buying Y DNA after, big Y after big Y after big Y. So vote for me.
Tanner for president. All right. We've got one more. Dorothy from YouTube is asking, as a woman, why would I take a DNA test except for mitochondria?
So as a woman, you don't have a Y chromosome, um, but you could recruit one of your brothers or your cousin, your uncles or your first cousins to take that Y-DNA test and represent your patrilineal line. For women, I'm a big fan of autosomal DNA. I would still say take that one, because that one, it doesn't matter what your gender is.
Okay. John from Zoom is asking, what does it mean when somebody has no big Y matches or Y37 matches?
That's actually surprisingly common. Um, Unfortunately, it just means that the databases need to get bigger.
Yeah, definitely. Carol from Zoom says that you have her vote in case you
Thank
wanted
you.
it.
Thank you.
Um, and Wanda is asking, which countries show the most Y testing? Is there any data on that?
Um, I'm sure that Family Tree DNA has that information on the back end. If I had to guess, it's America and Ireland, because people get interested in DNA when they're trying to figure out where they're from, right? And so Scandinavians, they have really good records and they already know what country they're from. So they don't need a big Y to tell them that they're Danish, right? Um, People in America, like all of these descendants of Christopher, are testing because they want to know, where in England are we from? Um, Ireland, because they blew up so many of their records, I think more of them are taking the test. Um, so yeah, I would say probably America one and Ireland is number two.
That's good to know. Um, one last one that we've got, and then I think we will have answered them all. Is Diane from Facebook is asking, what is the best way to find third great grandmother's parents?
Um, so yeah, so because you're looking for your third great grandmother's parents, you won't use Y-DNA, right? Unless she has a full sibling somehow that you know of, that's a male. Um, that's also one of the things about DNA is I like to say that with autosomal DNA, every generation that passes, your brick wall becomes 4 times harder to solve. And eventually, after 5 or 6 generations, it's just so much harder that it's just impossible. So yeah, that's why I encourage everyone to test and to buy autosomal tests for everyone in the oldest living generation that they can, to try and prevent that. So in your case, you're at the edge of what DNA could do. I mean, what you would want to do is you would want to try and look through the records and the DNA that you have and try and come up with a hypothetical family, like what people are living in the right time and place, for them to be her parents, or her father, and then figure out what other descendants they have and test them and see if they match you. And again, with each generation that passes, that just becomes harder and harder to do, but that would be your best option.
Awesome. And then this one is kind of like more generally related as well as the last one I found that I had not answered yet or like asked yet. But if somebody had like a deceased ancestor, but they had a cut of baby hair in a scrapbook or something, are there are there testing companies that could use that or that like that you could generate a kit with that kind of information by testing the baby hair?
Um, yes. There's one that I'm aware of called To the Letter DNA. And basically, they they can get DNA from like letters and, you know, glasses. Like when you know, a lot of times there's just crud on your glasses, from wearing them enough, and there's DNA in that. They could tell you specifically like what, if they could get DNA from your particular item. Um, DNA, when when the person's deceased, it starts to degrade over time. So generally, I think what they'll do is they'll look at your sample, they'll tell you they'll do a test to see how degraded it is and if it's possible to get DNA. And then when you get the DNA, I think it's over $2,000. So another reason to try and test people before they die. Um, it's expensive because they can't do it in the same way, right? It's just that hair is not going to be as good of a it's not as easy to get DNA from that as spit, right? Um, it's also going to be expensive because if you're really going that route, and with knowing that there is degradation, you're going to want to try and get as much DNA as possible. And so if you just buy an ancestry, my heritage, whatever, they're really only looking at like 700,000 key SNPs that are understood really well. Which means they're looking at like 0.01% of your DNA. In that case, with like the hair, they're going to look at every single nucleotide that they can. They're going to look at billions of them. So they're doing something called whole genome sequencing. Um, and even for living people, that's about $1,000 a kit. So yes, you can do it, but it's expensive.
Okay. I think those are all of the questions for this session.
Awesome.
Yeah. I think we can
Well,
wrap up. Thank you everybody for coming today. It's been quite a long day with all of the different classes, but we appreciate you coming and being a part of DNA Day today. And if you want to watch these classes later, they'll be available on the Roots Tech website in a few days, or you can watch the recordings on the Family Search Library Facebook page as well. And you can also look there for upcoming webinars if you'd like to be involved and watch our future webinars. Thank you.
yep. Thanks everyone for being here.